Hello, Andrew, and welcome to Hands in the Soil podcast. I'm really excited to have you here with me today. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Hannah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to connect. I'm excited to dive into our conversation. We've got some big bucket topics that I really want to talk with you about, and I'm excited to hear you speak more about. You have a few books that you've written, one that was recently published, and so I really want to talk with you about both of those. And I feel like there's just some bigger like food system topics that I'm excited to talk with you about. But before we get into that, I'm really curious how did you get into this work? How did you get into this area of research and writing in relation to food and agriculture? Was there something that kind of drew you to that space initially?
Yeah, I was always super interested in these connections of environment and society. And so I was drawn to that growing up in the woods in a smaller town than where I live now, a town of around 1,000 people in Elverson, Pennsylvania. And my grandma had gardens, and we had a garden, and I hated picking beans in it, as many kids do, just for like our own home needs. And when I got to college, I realized that there were dimensions of this that you could study, and I thought that would be like easy, so I could kind of get good grades and coast through college a little bit. And then the joke was really on me because I really enjoyed doing this work. In my sophomore year of college, I was lucky enough to be a participant in a program called the Ronald McNair Fellowship Program, which introduces people to research for the first time. And it was really the first time I knew that this was a job you could do. Talk to people, find out what they know, learn about the world professionally. I think before that, like a lot of people, I sort of knew that you went to college to have like one of the three jobs, which were engineer, lawyer, and doctor. And so it didn't occur to me to think really beyond that for my college experience. But this got me out there doing anthropology for the first time, which was really exciting. And I really enjoyed it. And I learned that you could keep going to school for these things. And so I kept doing research, in that case, in Cleveland Urban Gardens, from where I was based at Oberlin College. I cooked and worked in the student meal cooperative. So I learned how to cook pizza for 150 people and how to clean up after that mess. And then would spend my summers talking with people doing urban gardening or allotment gardening in that area. And then I was curious about how people were making a go of it because I graduated in 2010, and that was just after the recession. And so no one I knew was getting jobs. There were all these people with liberal arts degrees going off to be farmers. And I was really curious about what their lives were like and what that was doing to our food system, that all these new kinds of people were trying to make a go of it. And that's always kind of stuck with me, but I got a little bit derailed to do international research when I was doing my PhD. And so that allowed me to be fortunate enough to do research really all around the world with people who are doing this work of small scale, diversified family farming and know about all the wonderful things that they're doing and just how difficult of a livelihood that is and why the odds are so stacked against them in many cases.
Yeah. I had just had a conversation with a friend actually last week. I'm in San Diego, in Encinitas, and we have this. I'm in the farming space, but I tend to forget how niche of a space it is. And right now, we're kind of in this. I don't know if it's just like a season or a point in time where there's so many people that want to get into agriculture, and it's really exciting, and it's like people are really enthralled by it and enthused by it, and regenerative is kind of a buzzword. And it sounds like where you are, there actually is a little bit of a path to kind of get into agriculture in some way. Am I hearing that right? Like in maybe more of a traditional sense?
We're at a strange moment in the United States where we're continuing a swift and terrible decline, really from the 1930s, from the peak of farming families. And the number of farms has shrunk dramatically from around 6 million at its high point to right now in and around a little bit less than 3 million farming families. Meanwhile, the size of farms has increased dramatically over that same period of time. So way fewer farms, and they're much bigger. The problem for people who want to get into farming uh, is going to vary a little bit depending on the real estate prices and what we're dealing with, say, versus California versus in a space like Indiana. But in a lot of ways, people share that same problem. Uh, if you're not from a farming family, you've got little access to capital. You've got little access to land that would allow you to do this work. You aren't necessarily able to break into the supply chains that dominate how you can move your products, especially if you're trying to do something a little bit more diversified in your agriculture, where it's harder to make those connections, especially at a smaller scale and the volumes that you might be dealing with. And all of that's a huge problem, one identified by scholars like me, but also by the USDA, because if we want our food system to be resilient, to be less reliant on global supply chains, less reliant on oil disruptions or foreign wars, less reliant on labor bottlenecks when we have pandemics, or even if we want to make this a more remunerative and dignified job for the people who are doing this work of agriculture, we need more different kinds of people doing that work, and they need to be better connected. All of these difficulties are currently being meted out in a policy space through the Farm Bill. But the core problem of finding the right access to that land and the startup capital you would need in the first place is one really shared by all kinds of farmers, unfortunately.
Yeah, you've written a new book. It's called Feeding the World as If People Mattered: How Small Farms Produce Value Beyond Yields. And the name in itself, I was like, ooh, I
Yeah,
like
kind of a
this. I think
snarky
I'm
name,
gonna
right?
like this book. Yeah, it's great. I love it. And it is also something that I've spoken with people a lot of that word value in relation to food specifically, because as a small farmer, it's something that I've experienced, and I know many of my colleagues, other small farms that I know experience of that entity of just like the what can kind of be a little bit of a barrier of the cost, right? If I'm selling something at a specific cost that is reflecting the value of what this represents, of what I put into this in order to be able to run a business and make a business. And yet sometimes that cost is, it's either, it can be cost prohibitive for some people, but it also just can be at a higher cost than people are used to.
Mm-hmm.
And so that question of what people value and what they're willing to place value on onto something as such as food that's more than just this transactional cost, it can feel really challenging as a small farmer to try and communicate that with someone. Or, we want to bring people into this experience to understand that it is so much more valuable than just, okay, this costs, $5, and that's kind of, there's this monetary transaction. Can you just share a little bit about this new book that you've written and kind of what was the impetus, like what brought you into even bringing this book together?
This book grew out of conversations that I've been having, not just with farmers, but also with my colleagues here. I work at Purdue University, which is a major agricultural school and a land grant institution from the Morrill Act. And so much of the time, when we talk about feeding the world, or we talk about what the purpose of agriculture is, we're often talking about growing as much stuff as possible, or we're treating agriculture like a business, like any other. And at the same time, I hang out with tons of more alternative farmers, organic farmers, regenerative farmers, farmers who eschew labels of all kinds, but are strange and fun nonetheless. And they will sometimes find themselves trying to talk that same language. My yields are just as good, or my profits are better because my cost difference is X, Y, and Z, or I have a price premium. And to me, increasingly, it's felt like that's the wrong conversation to be having. We produce tons of food, way more food than the world can eat, and yet people are still hungry. This is certainly true in the United States. No matter how much food we seem to produce, around 10% of our population is food insecure. It's not that we don't subsidize our food in the United States, as many countries do. Americans spent around 10% of our budgets on average on our household food costs, which is incredibly low across history, but also incredibly low internationally if we take that metric comparatively. And yet still something isn't quite working. And after spending a lot of time with these farms that were trying to do something different or had a different sort of economic and social logic moving through them, it became pretty clear to me that part of the reason that it was a losing battle to fight this fight around yields, or we can do these things just as well, is that one, it distracted from the key purpose of what a lot of people were doing, which was make connection and grow healthy, nourishing food, or just keep space in the landscape and keep a landscape vibrant, as farming can certainly do. But it also set us up to have this kind of misleading conversation, because it's not a level playing field. If we're not paying for the cost of the true cost of labor, if we're not paying for the cost of land, if we're not paying for the cost of environmental degradation in soils and waters, then of course this organic option or this regenerative option is going to be more expensive. They're not paying for anything. We as a public, an eating and clothing wearing public, are paying all of those costs through our health, through the air that we share collectively, through the water that we share collectively. And so I really wanted to, right out of the gate, come up with a different conversation. So, I mean, if the point of all of our agrarian efforts is to, grow fast fashion and have sweatshops and skirt building codes and then wear clothes for 2 years and then rot them in landfills where they produce methane, and we can wash that all down with a cocktail of beef that's as cheap as possible and ethanol, then we're doing great. But if that's not the point of agriculture, then we ought to look a little bit more holistically. And so in this book, I go to Bosnia and India and the U.S. Midwest, where I've worked with small farmers and diversified farmers, and talk through with them some of the extra effort that they're putting in and try to cultivate a larger sense of value for all the things that they're really not just producing, but looking at agriculture as a form of reproduction, of continual growth and nourishing that makes it possible to live on Earth. So that's the as if people mattered kind of tone there. It's a shout out to a economic philosopher from the 50s and 60s, E.F. Schumacher. Old school environmentalists might recognize his book from the 1970s, Economics as if People Mattered, Small is Beautiful.
Okay. I have not read that either. That sounds
it's a
interesting
good
to
one.
me. Yeah. Yeah. I don't want you to give away too much of your book because I want everyone to read your book, but I am curious around some of the connections that you found in relation to these different places that you did visit and kind of experience agriculture in different ways. And I think in ways that I have traveled throughout the world, especially when I've been exploring agriculture, there's ways that we can see us show up in different ways, but I feel like what I often find is that there are so many more similarities than any of us ever realize. And I think when we come down to those spaces of like what matters and how do we show up as with people matter and like what's really what we value, those threads are very similar. So could you share just a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a joy to connect these threads among places that we wouldn't normally think of as being connected, like the U.S.
Yeah.
Midwest, Bosnia, and South India. So I'm an anthropologist, and part of what we do as a field of study is look at the similarities and differences between people and understand how all of that kind of fits together within a context. So India is a nation that has experienced European colonialism. It's a tropical environment. It's the nation with the largest number of small farmers on earth. It's also the nation probably with the most number of educated, highly educated people, given the vast number of highly competitive universities across the region. Bosnia is a place that experimented with non-Soviet socialism through the state of Yugoslavia, and then had a horrific civil war in the 1990s and is now working through some political and economic stagnation. The U.S. Midwest, a settler colonial nation, a nation where agriculture was in many ways part of a conquest of territory that was held by other people. And part of the story now is breaking up and re-diversifying that and understanding what an agriculture that is not based in conquest might look like for those who wish to be nourished by it. And through all of this, you've got small farming families. You've got this unified desire that small farming families have to try to be their own bosses, to not have people tell them what to do. That's one of the perks of being a farmer, to diversify their livelihoods so that in case one crop goes down or the market crashes for it, you've got other options, to uh, be able to keep farming, to maintain that as a way of life, that fundamental question of in order for anything to be sustainable, someone's got to want to keep doing that job and that work. And so between those contrasts and comparisons, I was looking for how people were continuing to sustain these relationships and really what was at stake for doing so. And so a lot of the similarities that I found were fundamentally when you've got a diversified economy as a farmer, you are keeping that diversified economy through a diversified ecology, which is helpful for us to see these really as the same thing. An economy is an ecology. This way of life is also a web of life that's supporting other living things in there. That's also true for the massive commodity farms that are near me here in Indiana. It's just an ecology that's quite hostile to other forms of life in a way that some of these other farms are not. And so I was really attentive to that biodiversity. I was out there with clipboards and grids checking how many living species there were, but also talking to farming families about how they kept this work going and why you would buck this trend if farming is a business where you're supposed to maximize yields, why they were thinking about it a little bit more holistically and how they made that work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love this conversation so much. And so you've written another book, and you also had sent me an article in relation to kind of looking at the specificities of the differences around organic and genetically modified cotton in India. And that does hold a very soft place in my heart because I did spend time in India, especially in the agricultural space, and met a lot of women farmers actually who had even lost their husbands to suicide because of what happened in relation to the Green Revolution and just like the massive greenwashing that came through with genetic modification and all these things. And can you speak a little bit more about that? There's like so many threads of these conversations that I want to tie in together, but could you just give a little bit of an introduction to some of the work that you did there and what that looked like?
When I graduated college, I started a PhD program at Washington University, St. Louis, working with Glenn Davis Stone on agriculture. And my initial plan was to go and hang out with all these friends of mine who had gone off to work in agriculture. And my advisor told me at that time, that's a good plan, but right now you're not married, you don't have any kids. Right now I've got 3 children. And now's a time in your life when you can go off on some further trips if you wanted to. So consider this. And so by the end of that first year, I found myself in India doing a follow-up to a study that he had done on genetically modified cotton. Why are farmers choosing the seeds that they're choosing? How is this crop working for them in all manner of ways? And on the very last week that I was there of a 2-month visit, doing surveys in farming households, I visited some organic farms and I thought this is a really interesting kind of comparison here. And that became a 6-year project where I would go and talk with farmers year after year about which seeds they were planting and why. And one of the key things that we found on the GM cotton side was that in a new kind of way, these crops had become a commodity when they weren't before. In the space of just about 10 years, we'd gone from having virtually no private seeds really in the market that farmers were interested in planting as cotton farmers to 95% of all the seeds being these private seeds, which happen to be genetically modified to produce the Bt cryotoxin, which is a toxin that affects caterpillars that would be eating these. A totally reasonable thing to want to put into cotton at this time. Cotton is incredibly pesticide intensive. Before the addition of Bt cotton, around half of all the pesticides that were sprayed in India were sprayed on cotton. So this would be a major intervention. And then social life comes into play. So in 2002, with the very first commercially legally available genetically modified seeds, 2001, 2002, there's 3 brands that you could buy, and farmers might be trialing some of those out. By 2011, or 2012, when I first arrived there, there's over 1,000. And so very quickly, you don't know which seed you're going to plant. And that's a very destabilizing decision. And what we were finding year after year was that there'd be a lot of uncertainty about what to plant, that fundamental decision. It's what scholars would call like a path dependent decision, because you can't make any other changes once you've done that. You're set on a path. And so once you planted this thing that you don't really know that much about, your whole base of knowledge is kind of destabilized. And we showed that in lots of different ways. We talked to people about what kind of yield they might expect to get, the growth habit of the cotton, how it responded to different sorts of pests, and answers were all over the map. A lot of it would not have, a scientist would not have agreed with a lot of this. Farmers didn't really agree with each other. Ultimately, what we were witnessing in real time was the erosion of a long-held knowledge around seeds and its replacement with a more consumer choice. Like, I don't know about you, it doesn't really matter to me necessarily which toothpaste I buy. Or a better example might even be wine, because I buy it by like which label might be funniest. I don't really know that much about wine. And this is a very similar situation that these farmers were finding themselves in. They were buying seed packets essentially for the labels. And there was a lot of aggressive branding and marketing what those labels would look like. But the difference, of course, is that my livelihood doesn't depend on like which fun bottle of wine I'm going to choose. Whereas if you choose the right seed and you get lucky in a season, your kids can pay their school fees, and maybe you can have a lavish wedding and you get to perform really well. And if you don't, then farmers talk about suicide and their debts mount. And it's this very public stage, the farm, in which everyone can see that you've failed, that you've done something wrong. And that can be very existentially crushing. And so it did nothing really to help with that social aspect of cotton agriculture. And ultimately, in the greatest irony, these BT cotton seeds have lowered some of the costs of planting cotton. So they've allowed cotton agriculture to expand such that India is growing more cotton than it did before, with these heavily dominated by these GM cotton seeds. And now Indian farmers are spraying more pesticides on these seeds than they were before the introduction of these pesticide-reducing GM seeds. None of this is necessarily because they're genetically modified, but rather because of this larger social and economic system into which these seeds are planted. On the organic side, you don't have very many choices. You're working with a development group. Very few public institutions are working to breed cotton seeds. And so you get a packet and you're told to plant it. And if you plant a genetically modified seed by accident, because 95% of them are on the market, like you got it from a store outside of this system, outside of your development organization, then you risk compromising the whole thing. And that's a huge deal. For like a European company, say, that might be doing genetic testing to make sure that it is indeed organic certified. So on the organic side, you don't really have that many choices. You go from choice overload on the GM farms to no choice at all, really, as to your seeds on organic farms. Your yields are lower. You're growing a lot more different kinds of things to make up for that. And my question really became, well, if the yields are so bad, why is it that people keep doing this year after year? They're not making a killing from these price premiums. It's really not enough to offset the volume that they'd be able to be producing. And scratching that kind of question led me to really think about what the purpose of farming is. I mean, the world doesn't need more cotton. We've had a cotton glut for a decade. Every year that I've been doing this research, the world has produced far more cotton than could be spun into clothing. It gets moldy in storage units and it catches on fire. At best, a lot of that cotton goes to be spun into fast fashion, which isn't really good for anyone's long-term well-being either. What these organic programs are more often able to do is provide a way out of that singular way to be successful that was offered by these GM cotton seeds, which is have a great yield, be a successful business person. Don't worry about the ag side. You're more of like an investor or a gambler. On the organic side, what these institutions do is they give you more options to reproduce that livelihood of agriculture rather than just build capital and grow larger. And that to me was incredibly interesting because people really wanted those options. Not only did it preserve biodiversity, it preserved lots of different ways to be successful in that farm landscape, to stay being a farmer fundamentally.
Mm-hmm. So did you find that piece was kind of what connected back to that aspect around the value of food, of agriculture, of small farms and being more of a smaller scale diversified farmer?
Absolutely. I would say that that unresolved question of
Mm-hmm.
given that the economic trade-offs clearly aren't working, there's
Yeah.
something else going on. And that really led me to continue asking those questions and to write this follow-up book, Feeding the World as If People Mattered.
Mm-hmm.
That first book was much more narrowly focused on these comparison of these two cotton systems. And ultimately, I kept finding myself in rooms talking to agronomists and agricultural economists and just people who, work on farms and were used to that being the clear answer. Well, why are we doing it then? And there really was a reason, but it wasn't necessarily anything to do with cotton. It had to do with a much broader livelihood. And that, I think, cracked it open enough for, me to understand what I was really looking at. So I'd be out there like with a clipboard and a survey that's single-sided, and it would say like, what seeds did you plant, and what was the brand, and where'd you get them, and how many times did you spray, and what was the yield, and all this stuff. But like the back of my papers would all be covered in notes about like, well, I couldn't spray today because my kid's sick and I had to take them to the doctor, but we had to borrow a ride and we had to go here and there. And it's like all of those neat answers that come in the box really were the least important data I could have had about why people were making the farming decisions they were making. It's all that other stuff. It's that real life that really determines what our agriculture systems look like. And that's only surprising to like this crew of academics. I think that
Mm.
when we fail to remember that agriculture doesn't just end at the farm's edge, it's this much larger holistic kind of way of living.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm enjoying kind of seeing this process through, like, there's a way that you have approached, right, everything that you have written about and experienced and learned, and I've never looked at it necessarily in that way and in such a scholarly context.
Yeah.
It's such a different way to analyze and assess and understand, and it's so important. It's so important, and it's such important work, and it's so important to have this information and these data and these numbers and have people that are engaging in the food system and in our agriculture systems in all these different ways. But I think that piece of what you just said of how it doesn't just end at the farm is so imminent and so important, and is something that so many people, they just forget. They forget how vital a role they play as someone you're just operating as a human, but like you're a part of this whole system just as much as the person who's planted whatever it is that you might be eating. And I feel like that part gets lost. And then there's the aspect of what I want to talk to you about more is kind of the policy side,
Mm-hmm.
where we have people who are so disconnected and so separate from that aspect of the real value that exists and what does matter and why, and in what ways it needs to function in order to support that, like, just I mean, it's efficiency, but it's more than efficiency. It's like the longevity, the like actual life and breath of a system that can exist and provide and, like live and breathe over time. And we have seen that right now where we've been seeing that for a while, where we have policy decisions that are being made by people who are not actually, I think, interfacing with those that really need to be a part of the conversation. But you had written an article around kind of looking at the Iran war and how we can see how that reflects the fragility within our food system. And yeah, I would love if you could just speak a little bit around like either how we can understand how policy informs and kind of supports what these systems look like. Because even with what you're speaking to with genetic modification and those differences, like policy really supports that in so many ways. And I think my question is kind of like the importance of policy and how those decisions do reflect what these systems can look like and how they can operate.
Policy is a great thing to be talking about because, of course, Congress is debating the Farm Bill right now. As we speak, a version of it has cleared the House and is moving forward. A couple of years ago, actually, let's go back to COVID. During the COVID era, we were hit with a food crisis because, of course, people couldn't work. And without those key hinges in the supply chain, especially in the supply chain that dominates much of our world, what's called the just-in-time supply chain, actually designed to make Toyota cars really efficient. Stuff arrives just at the time that it needs to be manufactured. And in food, that means that we're very careful about when and what quantities arrive so there's no spoilage. But if there aren't people to manage that work, as there weren't during the early days of the coronavirus pandemic and the shutdowns, then you have a lot of spoilage and you have a lot of waste and you have enormous inefficiencies that emerge out of those key bottlenecks. There were stories of farmers plowing their crops under because it wasn't worth the money to harvest them. This at the same time that key safety nets and food security for people who are poor and thus have the most risk from food insecurity, that they weren't able to get the food that they wanted. So a massive discrepancy there. Into that mix, Congress briefly expanded a universal meal program. Basically, anyone who went to public school could get a school lunch for free, no questions asked. And part of the reason that this was so incredibly popular among school administrators was that you don't have to do incredibly arduous paperwork, effectively assigning an entire employee role to figuring out who's really eligible for what kind of reduction in lunch and how to calculate that back, and then sending money back to the state and collecting money from the parents and doing everything that you would need to do to manage this massive bureaucracy. It's just everybody gets a lunch. A lot of that lunch funding to make up for that expansion came from local farmers who weren't involved in that previously, who were selling in different supply chains but had found these new markets. And so the government became this massive buyer for local food for feeding kids, which fed kids might be an unquestioned good for people who listen to this, but let's say that some people don't like fed kids. It still helps to make those school children who wouldn't be benefiting from a school lunch, they still perform better. Even the kids who are of privilege and are doing really well, they perform better because when other kids are well fed, they're less disruptive in the classroom. As anyone who's spent time in a classroom knows, hungry kids are not great listeners, and this provides all kinds of rippling benefits. Another benefit would be that working parents don't have to go out and prepare those foods every day and get that half an hour, or don't have to have that fight with their kid at school. So a lot of rippling benefits from that investment. Congress allowed that to expire in 22, I believe, but several states, including most vocally Minnesota, led then by Governor Walz, he catapulted in many ways a national career through the signing of these school lunch bills. And lots of other states are working on these. Programs are incredibly popular across parents and teaching organizations. Out of that energy, in some parts, a lot of local farmers saw a lot of renewed interest in their stuff during COVID because people were frustrated with grocery stores and didn't want to go in and were willing to try this other system. And so to sustain some of that interest, Congress had briefly the Local Foods Procurement Act, which invested effectively $1 billion into local food buying programs. That unfortunately ended in 2025. This new farm bill has a version of a local food procurement lever that belongs to the states rather than the federal government. And so it's a little bit murkier how exactly that would work and how it would interface. But we see here some of the lessons that I think are super important. If you want to support local farmers, make sure that they've got a supply chain they can work with. Don't pull the rug out from them. If you want to support local farmers, have two institutions working together, like a public school system and a local food distribution system, such that there's a clear end consumer, there's a clear market, there's a place for this stuff to go to. We can also see some of the fragility of globalized systems. They couldn't pivot as well during COVID, which is why there was such an upsurge in local agriculture. Same now during an oil crisis caused by military action from the U.S. and Israel and Iran in the Strait of Hormuz. With that, with that oil pinch, a lot of transportation prices are now more expensive, and they still can't pivot to just grow something else or grow differently in a way that a regional, local food system could do that. We don't need to reinvent this. We can look to places like India, where probably the most successful anti-poverty mechanism on earth exists, which is the midday meal scheme, where all
Mm.
public school kids in India are guaranteed by the Constitution a hot meal, and that is sourced locally and cooked locally by people who live in that area. So you're creating tons of jobs, you're creating tons of value, a future investment in the health and well-being of children and allowing them to pay attention at school, as well as seeing these jobs as a benefit rather than as a cost, which we might so often be used to seeing them if we're just looking at that initial monetary price. And so there's lots of things that we can learn from these policies as well as from some of these international cases.
Do you think that example is something that we could do here in the US, like on a national
We
level?
already did it. We
Yeah.
we already guaranteed school lunches. Um, there's a wonderful book by the scholar Jennifer Gaddis called "The Labor of Lunch," which talks about the early school lunch programs with the early public school programs, and they were in many ways job programs in at their heyday. In the early 20th century, where it was a good thing to be employing tons of people to make this work. A lot of schools now, the difficulty is not in the procurement of food, but in the procurement of space and trained employees who are going to be doing that kitchen work because there's so much
Hmm.
reheating. But that too is a policy choice. We have done it in the past. We chose to end these things. We could choose to restart them again. And if we look to some of the recent big studies on the rippling benefits of investments in our school food. There's one I'm thinking of that came out of the Rockefeller Institute just a couple of years ago. You get effectively a 2-to-1 return on your investment in jobs created and other money that then gets spent and circulated in the community, as well as future economic benefits from people who do better in school through these kinds of programs. So it's incredibly worth it if we're willing to spend that time and energy.
I always think of like, there's the bottom up and top down approaches to things and how they can also balance
Mm-hmm.
and meet each other. But do you see how ways that policy can also help inform some of that understanding or even like cultural shift or, societal shift towards those pieces around like, oh, the value of food and ways in which we show up and kind of relate to and place value on these things that do exist as well?
I would hope so. In India, I've doled out a number of these meals. There's no stigma, there's no weirdness or bad feelings about the school lunch. The school lunch is great. It is objectively delicious. It's cooked by your friends and neighbors and family members. It gives value to this agrarian identity that, if we've got like a yeoman farmer identity in the US, it's dialed up to 1 million over in India, where there's quite a lot more rural farmers. That's a point of pride. There's no reason that we need to look at school lunches and say that's gross or that's something that we ought to feel ashamed of. There are plenty of civic actions that we do feel pride in, and wouldn't it be grand if more of them were these things that nourish us and provide our friends and neighbors with jobs?
Yes, that's very true. So in your research and just what you've experienced, how do you see some of those ways in which we could have more of a resilient food system that's operating right now?
Some of the key through lines that I've seen across these different sites are that need to have institutions work together. So if we're going to have a local food system, there must be some market and distribution where it goes, and school lunches are one in different ways that lots of different institutions or states have tried, including the United States, but also the India example I was talking about before. In Brazil, there's a very famous example of Belo Horizonte, studied by other people, but including Dr. Jahi Chappelle, and his book Beginning to End Hunger. And what the state did really was empower a lot of local vendors to source food. So it wasn't necessarily coming from schools directly, but rather state funds were helping lots of entrepreneurs to feed these kids. So more of a bottom up kind of approach to meeting that need for hunger. And again, incredibly successful. And these sorts of win-wins where if we've decided that efficiency means a fed child who goes to school, and efficiency means jobs, these programs are incredibly good at that. If efficiency means paying as little of the cost and building capital in a bank, then perhaps some of our these programs seem like failures. But I'm an anthropologist, so I get to play the cross-cultural card here. Efficiency means lots of different things in lots of different kinds of scenarios. I live in Indiana. My energy comes from coal. Coal is efficient for me in Indiana because it's a fuel that I don't have to pay a whole lot of money for, and it burns for a long time, allowing these turbines to move. If I lived in parts of the country where this coal is actually from, I would think it's incredibly inefficient because I couldn't breathe the air, and my kids would have asthma, and I couldn't drink the water. I grew up in eastern Pennsylvania, and one of the big fights. Earliest environmentalist fight that I can remember actually was a water extraction from some of our aquifers for bottling companies, and that later paved the way for fracking a little bit west of where I grew up. That fuel is efficient if you don't have to deal with those environmental consequences, or if you don't want to go hiking and fishing in those areas, or if you don't need that water. But if those spaces are important, then yeah, that's incredibly inefficient. Even on its face, efficiency is a great thing to talk about because efficiency is often a trap. I was mentioning a moment ago the efficiency potential of this BT cotton, the genetically modified cotton. So it's efficient. You don't have to spray it as many times because it's got that pesticide kind of built into it. That should be a good thing, right? Because pesticide spraying is really, really bad for people. It's really persistent, especially these sprays for the caterpillars, stays on your hair and your clothing. It's in the air on hot days when everyone's spraying and their pores are open and this mist just kind of covers people. But the more that this cotton was planted, the more people had to spray it because there was more of it. Efficiency allows us to do more of the thing that we were supposed to do less of if we don't change anything else in the system. Hybrid cars are driven over greater distances. Efficient refrigeration has allowed us to ship vegetables all around the country, but increased our use of refrigeration. A lovely book called More Work for Mother. Efficient household appliances didn't do anything to liberate women from housework. You did that work, and then you did other stuff in the house at the moment that these technologies were introduced. And so efficient technologies without addressing the underlying logic of the thing you're working in just leads you to do more of that same. So we would do really well if we wanted to transform or think more critically about our food systems to redefine what that value is all about. And of course, that's, the main impetus for writing this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that the conversation around efficiency is very interesting because it's something that we really pride ourselves on. I think
Sure.
It kind of becomes this definition of success. But yes, when you start to look at it more, what is it really leading to, and what is it really providing us, and what is it replacing, right? What are we kind of sacrificing in order to keep being efficient in whatever way we're even defining that term, of what that means to us and why.
It's a great conversation to have. I love walking into agriculture classes, and I write in giant letters on the board, WTF, which is why to farm. And so people will give all kinds of answers. Often one that comes up every time is to feed the world. Another one that comes up is, to make money as a business. But as the conversation goes, we can really get into it. Because if we're feeding the world, okay, what do we grow? What do different countries grow? What do different states grow? What's the history there? much of what we grow in the United States is not food for human consumption, especially here where I live in Indiana. It's food for animals, or it's food for, it becomes part of a food additive, or it's ethanol in the case of corn. As much as 40% of our very impressive corn yields in some years go to ethanol, which is incredibly inefficient if the point of agriculture is to feed people. Jobs, nourishing an environment, keeping a heritage alive, those are all wonderful reasons that go beyond this narrow and really quite limiting to human potential view of what the purpose of agriculture is.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and then that comes back to the part around if you're just measuring yields,
Mm-hmm.
but you're not actually looking at the why or the who, or, where are those yields going to? What are they providing? Who are they providing for? And are we even asking those questions, or are we not? Then we kind of get stuck in those places too. Because I would say, yes, our system is incredibly inefficient, even though we tend to value and pride ourselves on being efficient. We're efficient at producing things, but we're actually incredibly inefficient at producing what we need. And then we have to just, everything that's produced from that efficiency tends to just, kick ourselves in the foot a little bit more.
Or you might say, let's shift the conversation from producing stuff to reproducing life. And that might allow us to see things differently. One of the metaphors that I draw on in the book is the metaphor of the iceberg economy. So up at the top of an iceberg, the visible bit, we've got wages, and we've got capital, and we've got the production of goods, all these things that we might casually say, okay, that's the economy. But all of that production is supported by this vast architecture beneath the surface of care work and of laying infrastructure and long-term planning, all the stuff that goes into making it possible for someone to go to work in the first place. I couldn't talk to you right now unless my wife Iris was holding our 8-week-old baby. We've had to arrange that time. This looks to my like what we're doing right now might look to my university like normal professory stuff that I would do. I talk to people, and I've done research, and then now I'm communicating it. But it's not as though Iris, who's holding the baby, gets a paycheck from the university in recognition of the work that made it possible for me to be here in the first place. And that is a limiting view of everything that's possible. In the book, I take a more agrarian metaphor of a beet. So you can eat beet greens, and people do. I like beet greens, but that's not like the important bit. That everything else that's really exciting about agriculture and about the beet lies under the surface, supporting all these things that make it possible for us to nourish a landscape in the first place.
Yeah, I love that. So for anyone who would like to read your book, either of your books, where would be a good place for them to find them?
So these books were published by the University of Arizona Press. You can find them at your local bookstores or online retailers. If folks order from the press website and they use a coupon code AZFLR, they'll get 30% off. But Earmuffs Press, look, if there are curious people and $30 is a barrier, just write me an email. And I would love to have that conversation with you. And, the point of these things, if we talk about efficiency, my success is not measured in copies sold so much as copies read. So if folks want to check this out, I would love to make that happen for you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we'll put the links to both your books in the show notes, and then we can put your email in the show notes as well for anyone who wants to reach out. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on today and for your time and for sharing more about your work and what you're up to. I'm really curious to read your book. Like I said, as soon as I read the title, I was like, oh yeah, this is going to be a book that I feel like I resonate with.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'd love to know. I'd love to hear from you and anybody else what you think of it.